Greetings, friends. My name's Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm here today with Sarah Walkenfeld, the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, which is the world's largest free digital library of Jewish texts and translations. Here at JPS, in recent years, we've been honored to work and join with Sefaria to make a range of texts and translations available to individuals and communities across the globe. And I'm grateful to Sarah for joining me today to think together about a variety of questions, including the nature of translation, the work that we've undertaken together, and really the future of Jewish texts and Jewish learning. Sarah, thank you so much for making the time to think and speak together today.
Thank you so much. We've been honored to partner with JPS, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today.
Well, the feeling is very much mutual. So as I mentioned in my opening comments, at Sefaria, you describe yourselves as the world's largest free digital library of Jewish texts and translations. Can you tell us a little bit more about Sefaria? Who are you, and kind of why do what you do? What's your animating mission?
Absolutely. Safaria's mission is really simple. Our mission is to create the future of Torah by maximizing its impact in the digital age. It comes from a place of wanting all Jews everywhere to be able to access the texts of our tradition. And it comes from a place of wanting to live in a world where Torah is alive and resonant to the full spectrum of the Jewish community. And we really want to do that by creating this open access library and not just having the text there and available, but really building, as we think of them, on-ramps, building ways for people to find these texts, discover more, engage with texts. And that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years.
I love that vision of on-ramps, because I think often these texts are kind of experienced and encountered by so many people as kind of closed books, both kind of literally and figuratively. I know that one of your longstanding passions at Sefaria, and you kind of personally, is the way in which translation is part of this project of making texts accessible. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, kind of why focus in particular on translation? Why is translation so important? And why do you often include kind of multiple translations of the same text on Sefaria? I mean, why not just create one on-ramp per text? Why isn't one translation enough?
So I think, as you said, translations are among those on-ramps that we're building. We can have a debate another time maybe about whether all Jews should read Hebrew or what it would look like for that to happen. But the reality is that they don't. And we know that Jews are accessing these texts in a number of languages. Sefaria would like to have not only English, but translations into multiple languages. And in many cases, we do. And we'd like to have multiple translations. And that's because, as you know, every translation is really an act of interpretation. Languages have different ways of referring to things, different idioms. Even the translation, I would go so far as to call it a translation from the Hebrew text of the Bible into modern Hebrew. Even that is a translation and an interpretation. And we have, in some cases, added modern Hebrew translations of texts that are already in biblical Hebrew. The idiom, the turns of phrase, just the language of biblical Hebrew is not the same as modern Hebrew. And we have even added some translations of Hebrew texts into modern Hebrew for our Israeli users. And so it's very important to Sefaria that we have translations into as many languages as possible and as many different translations as possible. And I think that it has been challenging at times to explain to readers, explain to the learners on our site, you might not agree with every translation if you are someone who has some sense of the original, or just you've studied from a different translation in the past. You might believe that the English text should be this way and not that way. And part of our role is to educate people about the many different translations that exist and the multiple possibilities for biblical interpretation that are real live possibilities. And we love the ability of our site, the technical abilities of our site, to showcase the ways in which one Hebrew text can generate so many different meanings in English and beyond.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So that work of educating and explaining and engaging is, I think, so important. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. In your experience, what are some of the most common misconceptions when it comes to translation? What do you wish that people knew or thought about when it comes to translation that they don't typically know or don't typically think about?
Maybe not the perfect answer to your question, but I think our best Sefaria story about this comes from a teacher who emailed us on behalf of her first grade class to say that the students had found a mistake in our biblical translation and they wanted to talk to us about it. It was probably the JPS, actually, and that was really, first of all, a delightful conversation with the children who had found the mistake, and a great opportunity to explain to them that a word that they knew, that they had learned the definition of, in a different context, maybe in multiple different contexts, might have a different meaning in the context of the Bible, or might just be translated differently and interpreted differently by a given translator and interpreter. And in some ways, that's the work that we need to do with all of our learners, is to help people understand that there's a myriad of ways that you might translate the Bible. The Talmud says that one of the things that's miraculous and amazing and divine about the Bible is that one word can shatter into 70 meanings. And that's really what I think of when I think about the translations that we offer on Sefaria. You don't have to pick. You could like one translation for one verse and a different translation for another. And also, both can be in some way true to the text. And translators are always making choices. I think that's the thing that I would most want people to know, is that translators are always making choices about what to prioritize. And I think sometimes it might seem that this person, they didn't know, or the translator didn't know that this word could also mean this, or they didn't realize. And I think that might be true sometimes, but I think in many cases, it's the translator making a choice to prioritize one meaning of a word over another, or to use words that flow together better, that are going to sound nicer together in English, rather than a more literal definition. And it's something we really consider when making decisions about translations on Sefaria. Do we want something that's as true to the original as possible and reads terribly in English, or would we rather something that's more literarily pleasing, even if it fudges the Hebrew a little bit? We don't always get to make those choices, but I think that's an example of the kinds of choices that a translator might make, and those aren't always visible to the reader.
I love that story, not only because it sort of illuminates this point about choice when it comes to translation, but also because I think it really gets at how translation can actually be a path to opening people's horizons and imaginations when it comes to a life of Jewish learning. I'm imagining how transformative that conversation you had with that first grade class was for those students, not just in terms of their experience of the Bible, but really their experience of Jewish learning and Jewish life. I'll admit I also like that story because it's about the JPS translation. So, as we're also in the translation business at JPS, and we are kind of incredibly honored that we've been able to join with you at Sefaria to actually make 3 versions of our Tanakh translation, 3 versions of our Hebrew Bible translation online. Our first English translation from 1917, was probably our best known translation from 1985. And our first major update of that 1985 translation, which is actually scheduled to be released in just a few days in October 2023. There's also, for those of you keeping score, there's another JPS translation just of the Torah from 2006 available on Sefaria. As you pointed out, there are a lot of different approaches to translating Tanakh out there. Our particular approach to translation at JPS is one that we sometimes like to describe as both kind of historically rigorous and religiously musical. We try to kind of draw on the best of academic Bible scholarship and on the best of Jewish religious learning to present a translation that's faithful to the Hebrew, that captures what the Bible meant in its original context, and that somehow does all of that in a manner that resonates with contemporary readers. But that's not the only way to think about Bible translation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, at Sefaria, how do you think about Bible translation? What do you see as different factors that different translators have to weigh when making the Tanakh accessible? And what are some of the different approaches that you see in different editions that are featured on Sefaria?
There's such a wide range of possibilities, and it's hard to even take into account all the different ways in which a translation might sound correct or just sort of pleasing to a learner. I think part of it is also what you're used to. I'll give you an example. I think most people would recognize the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's true, I think, actually, for Christians as well. I think it's just sort of true across Western society. And if you came up with a very different translation, that would be jarring for people. Some people would probably like that. There is certainly a school of translation that believes that if you do something that's sort of off the beaten path, it'll make people stop and rethink a familiar passage. But there's also people who would hate that and would say, no, like this is what it's supposed to say. It's supposed to say, love your neighbor as yourself. If it doesn't say that, it's not the Bible. And so that's something that we think about a lot, is sort of the familiarity versus newness factor. Do I want to see the text that I typically open in my synagogue? If I am a synagogue goer and I go on Shabbat, or my temple, is that the translation that I most like because it's familiar? Or do I want to try something new? That's definitely a factor we consider. We want to have the translations that will resonate with our very diverse community of learners. Sefaria has over 650,000 unique users a month. That's a lot of people to try to keep happy. And we know that we can't please all of the people all of the time. And yet we're really trying to speak to those different audiences. So I think for us, the most important factor in some ways in Bible translation is the diversity. JPS has a long and rich history of translating the Tanakh, as you mentioned. The 1917 JPS was, I think, the first English text we ever put up on Sefaria. I believe that when I started working at Sefaria, it was the only English text that we had on the site. And it's been really important to us to, whenever possible, always update with the most current version of the JPS as a kind of core translation of the American Jewish community. And we've enjoyed adding more translations, and there's a lot more that we'd like to add and hopefully will in the coming years.
Yeah. I love that example of the love your neighbor as yourself. It's a line that we've wrestled with at JPS, right? How do we get at what that line may have meant in the Bible's original historical context in terms of ancient Israelite society, but how do we get at the incredibly rich kind of ethical and interpretive and theological afterlife that line has had as well. I don't want to give any spoilers for how we translated at JPS. I want people to go to the site, but I love that example. And we're also really honored and grateful for that commitment at Sefaria to kind of working with JPS to kind of make new versions of our translation available. As I alluded to earlier, we actually have our newest update of our translation, our first major one in 4 decades, known as the Revised JPS Translation, or RJPS, available in just a week or so from when this is being recorded. It has the title, the JPS Tanakh Gender Sensitive Edition. It's actually the first Jewish gender sensitive translation of the Hebrew Bible. And what that means is that it goes through the Bible word by word, line by line, verse by verse, to try to offer gender inclusive translations where appropriate, and also gendered translations when called for historically and linguistically. So, translators are asking questions such as whether a term for a human being should be translated as person or as man. Translators are asking questions such as whether a reference to God should be translated with gender neutral language, say just as God, or with a male sounding term such as king. And again, the goal, as with all of our translations, is that balance of historical rigor and religious musicality, that aspiration for a translation that's faithful to Hebrew, that offers a window into what the Bible meant in its original context, and then again, that really speaks to contemporary audiences. And there are other kind of revisions we make as well, including updating archaic or unclear terminology and English phrasing. Over the years, I'm curious, what sorts of questions and comments about Bible translations have you heard from Sefaria users? And how do you think that this new translation that we're about to release here at JPS might address some of those questions and some of those comments?
I think my story earlier demonstrates we've had so much feedback over the years from so many different people. And my hope, and I know that this is something that you and I have talked about a lot, and it's really part of the goal of this conversation, I think, is to raise people's consciousness around translation. I think that that's something that this translation does, because whether you agree with any given translation choice or disagree, I think that one thing that this translation for sure will do is make you notice the art of translation. And again, whether you agree or disagree with the specific word choice or the gender or non-gendered choice that the translators here make, I think it does draw your attention to, well, if I don't think that that's what the Hebrew means, what do I think that the Hebrew means? And if I don't think that this is the best possible translation, what is or what would be the best possible translation? And one of the conversations that has emerged as we've been putting up more translations is people saying, well, like, I don't really like this one. I don't really like this one. And when we say, well, what do you like? Often the response we get is, I'm not so sure, right? Like, nothing really seems perfect. And I actually think that in some ways, maybe a translation has done its job, if that's the impression you come away with, that at the end of the day, you feel like that was a good read and that was a powerful act of interpretation because it moved me in some way. And I kind of want more. I always want the next translation. I always want to see what more is possible. I don't think that's a bad outcome from reading a translation. And so I'm just happy when people engage on the question of what makes a good translation, what do I want out of a translation. I think that is good for Torah learning. It's good for book translators. And so just generally a good thing.
No, and I part of what's so powerful, Sarah, about that answer, and that really resonated with me at least, is, it sort of casts translation as a kind of invitation, as an invitation to further wrestle with the text, explore the text, kind of dwell with the text. You mentioned that point about agreement or disagreement. And, as some viewers will be aware, this newest update of the JPS translation, RJPS, did cause some controversy when portions were posted on Sefaria this summer. And in particular, I know that some individuals were troubled or concerned that Sefaria had made something called a gender-sensitive translation available as one of the many English versions that are hosted on your website. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, why did Sefaria decide to make RJPS available as one of its translation options?
As I mentioned, Sefaria is always looking for new translations that will serve different segments of our diverse population. Again, we have a lot of people using Sefaria in a lot of different places, both physically different places, actually all over the world, and also coming from a lot of different places religiously. And we want Sefaria to speak to all of those learners, and we want Sefaria to be able to open up pathways of learning to advance their learning for all of those people. And that was our goal in adding the RJPS. In addition, we had the 1917, we kept updating the JPS has been and remains a central Jewish translation of the Tanakh. We wanted to keep updating that. We wanted to have that, and we want to give an option that resonates, that we know will resonate with a lot of our users. I think it did draw attention for those for whom it doesn't resonate, to it drew attention to the fact that that Sefaria has different translations. I mean, I think that was a point of confusion. People who said, I don't like this translation. How can I not use this translation? And then we had to do a better job of explaining, actually, Sefaria doesn't push any one translation on its users. Actually, you can always switch translations. It's funny almost, because this is something that used to come up in the early days of Sefaria a lot, before we had multiple translations. When we only had the JPS 1917, I would get educators telling me either, I really don't want my students to use English, or people telling me, you should take this, with love. This is a terrible translation, right? Like, this is a terrible translation. My students can't read this English. Or, there were times when that English was read as borderline offensive, because it uses words that we probably wouldn't use in modern discourse, but it was translated in 1917. And so I think this was a kind of reiteration of some of the conversations we had then. It's a translation. You don't have to like it. You can turn off the translation. or you can switch to a different translation. So I'm not surprised that gender is a hot button issue. I don't think we needed the RJPS to tell us that, but I do think it opens up a really important conversation about what it means to have a digital library that offers so many different options and what it looks like for users to take control of their experience on the site.
No, I really appreciate that. And I think I will somehow recover from hearing that there are some people who've had concerns about the 1917 translation. This may come as a shock. I was actually not directly involved in our 1917 translation, so I will not take it personally. But, I think more seriously, part of why there is then our landmark 1985 translation and our new translation is also that translations are always products of particular moments in time. And I think, at least on the JPS side, one of our enduring questions is, how can we make the Bible's kind of timeless text and timeless teachings accessible in a world that is itself deeply time bound and always changing, right? How do you provide access to a past and to a text that is going to be accessible in different ways to different readers at different moments? Also, we've talked a little bit about the past. We've talked about the present. I maybe want to conclude just by thinking about the future. So as I mentioned, we're thrilled and honored to be able to join with you to make texts available to individuals and communities across the globe. How would you like to see Sefaria, JPS shape Jewish learning and Jewish life going forward?
I'm really excited to be able to continue to add more texts to Sefaria's library. And that is a potential that is embodied by the relationships that we have with important publishers, JPS, very much among them. Our relationship goes back a long time. Our relationship's been really productive, and I feel that we're united in a mission of making Torah accessible. And that's really exciting to me. There are a lot of other titles that have been published by JPS over the years. You have really, again, a very rich history of not just translation, but book publication. And this is something that Sefaria is just still at the beginning stages of exploring, is what other modern texts can we put up? I would group translations into English by and large as modern works, meaning they are generally not produced, more than a few hundred years ago at the very most, right? We're talking mostly about, 1900s and beyond. And so looking more at other kinds of modern texts, that's something that I'm excited to be able to do with you in the future. And I also would say that it's very exciting to be in relationship with JPS because you're continuing to put out new works. And Sefaria's mission is about the future of Torah in the digital age, but our vision is about existing in a world where Torah is alive and resonant. And we can only do that with great partners. We can only do that if we're surrounded by other organizations who believe in that. And JPS is very much one of the organizations that we think of when we think of crafting that world together.
Well, and I'll just kind of reciprocate that by saying that, on the JPS side, part of what makes us so excited and grateful to be able to partner with you at Sefaria is the way in which you are kind of broadening our imaginative horizons when it comes to what a Jewish text can be and what engaging a Jewish text can look like, in terms of the resources that can be brought to bear, the styles of learning that can be employed, and the kinds of conversations both within communities and across communities that can be enabled. So we are incredibly grateful to be able to partner with you, and I'm really grateful to you, Sarah, for taking the time to speak with me today, and for all that you and your colleagues have done to make the world of Jewish texts and translations accessible to readers and communities across the globe. To learn more about Sefaria, please visit their website, sefaria.org. You'll see a link in the comments below. To order your copy of our newest Tanakh translation, our JPS, you can also visit our site, jps.org. There will also be a link in the description below. And we look forward to future conversations about future translations, texts, and opportunities for learning.
Thank you, Eli. This was really great. I'm honored to be here.